You're watching LMCC.
Welcome to Westonka Memories. My name is Pam Myers, and I volunteer with the Westonka History Museum. Today I'm interviewing Ron Pauly, who worked in product design for Tonka Toys right here in town. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you.
You were in product design for Tonka. Tell me how you got into product design.
Kind of by accident. In part one, we finished up with Bernie Melchesky. I had gone to Stout and decided to go a different route in Stout State College. Bernie Melchesky, who was Charlie Groshen's brother-in-law, was putting a forced air heating system into our house to replace the parlor stove, Junger's parlor stove that we had to keep the big farmhouse warm. And in conversations with him, I mentioned that I had been exposed to sheet metal at Stout, and he suggested that I go to Dunwoody and take up sheet metal work, which, by the way, was what his brother-in-law had done. He went to Dunwoody, took up sheet metal work, and Charlie Groshen, and ended up working for Markson Company, a heating contractor here in Mound. So I applied it and started at Dunwoody in 1961.
And how did you get connected with Tonka?
Well, I got a job, a part-time job on Saturdays and holidays off from when I was going to school with a fellow by the name of Bill Ishii, who had a little sheet metal shop south of Cologne on the road that goes to Belle Plaine. And he had a contract with Farmhand. They made farm equipment. He had a contract with them to make dust collectors for a feed mixer that they were building up in Green Isle, Arlington. And so I wasn't the only employee he had, but I'd go over there and help him. He'd get a order maybe for a dozen or a couple dozen of these dust collectors, and I would help him finish the order. But while I was there, if I'd finish early, then I would use his sheet metal shop to make a couple of model toys.
Ah.
But when I was a child, I was already into redesigning the stuff. So, for instance, this is a this dump truck came out in '64, but it only had a single set of wheels here. And I had, on a previous Tonka toy, I had put tandem wheels on it, but I used erector set pieces to put tandems on it, and I painted the white sidewalls on it, stuff. So I'm 12 years old or so, and I'm starting to redesign this stuff because I didn't like exactly the way Tonka had done it. Well, there used to be a dump on the west side of Mound where the intersection of 44 meets with 110. There's a housing development there now, but I and another friend of mine would come down once in a while on our bicycles and go and pick out tires or parts so we could build toys out of wood or whatever. But this originally was a cab meant to pull an Allied van trailer. But again, I didn't particularly care for the way it came with just one set of wheels here, so I used erector set pieces to lengthen the frame, and
I see.
You know. So I was doing that, like I said, when I was 12, 13 years old.
I see. I have heard you tell a story about where you were working when you were hired by Tonka. You want to tell that story?
Well, I was I had to go to, one of the requirements was you had to go to Dunwoody to get into the Sheet Metal Workers Local 34, which, by the way, Charlie Groshen belonged to also. But I was working on the Convention Hall addition to the Minneapolis Auditorium in 1964, which was taken down and replaced by the big convention hall that's there now. So a big Lorraine, 65-ton Lorraine truck crane came on the job site, and it just blew me away. It had double steering front axles, which today is very common, but back then that was something new. So my dad drove school bus down here for Vern Christensen, and I told him, I said, stop at Tonka Toys and get me 10 mighty Tonka wheels so I can make a model of this truck crane. So he stopped and ended up talking to Charlie Groshen. And Charlie Groshen, he told Charlie Groshen about a toy semi-model I had made and earth mover, and Charlie wanted to see those. So my father, in October of '64, took those two models into Charlie Groshen, and Charlie said, if your son wants to do that for a living, have him come in some Saturday, which I did in November, and I started as the 4th product design model maker that Charlie had hired. The first one was Lee Filesticker, and then it was, I'm not sure, it was Ted Zibikowski, who was the supervisor of our group, and Johnny Danielson. So I was the 4th person.
You had a number of different job responsibilities early on, as I recall, as well. It wasn't all toys, was it?
Tonka couldn't keep the factory going all year round building toys because of the sales volume. So unbeknownst to me, in 1964, they had bought a barbecue grill business out of Chicago, Mal Manufacturing. That was a perfect fit for off-season. So when you're basically done building toys for the peak Christmas season, you know, you can build barbecues for spring.
I see.
You know, in summer. So it was a perfect fit. Well, I didn't know that when I took the job, and I got stuck designing and redesigning and making barbecue grill cabinets and everything else, and I've got a catalog I can show you. And I was complaining about it, and Lee Filesticker said, well, I said, I wouldn't have taken the job if that's all I was going to do. And Lee says, well, that's the only reason Charlie hired you. If you look over my shoulder, there's a Jeep, and the only toy I got to work on was to design the snowplow for the front of that Jeep wrecker. Charlie and Filesticker worked on this and came out with this mighty dump in 1964. And 65, the crawler crane, clamshell crane. Well, Charlie says we should have a loader, a front-end loader to go with that. Well, when I was a kid, Nyland made a front-end loader that worked with our regular-sized dump truck and their regular-sized dump truck. Oh. So it was an expensive, well, to manufacture it was relatively expensive because it was kind of like a forklift. It had big wheels in the front and small wheels in the back that would steer. And so there's a lot of, the steering wheel was right here, and then loader arms. So there's a lot of linkage and stuff, a lot of parts. So we knew that making a loader mighty sized would be an issue. So what we did was we got literature from Caterpillar and all the other companies that made front-end loaders. But one of them, Huff, H-O-U-G-H, they had a tie-in, I believe, with International Harvester, came out with this new front-end loader, which was unique then and is still unique, because if you look at front-end loaders today, for instance, the operator sits with the motor, and only the front axle rotates with the loader arms, okay? This was different. The operator sits with the loader arms, so that right away we knew that's the toy we needed to, or the real loader we needed to copy. No steering mechanism. All it is basically is you put one hand on the cab roof and the other on the motor, and you got your steering. So Vern Peterson was, when I started there, was a wood model maker. And Paul Bossard was the draftsman and tool engineer. So there were 6 of us in that department at that point in time. So what we did is we started, Vern Peterson and I kind of collaborated, and we made a full-size wood model that would work with the Mighty Dump. And then, which was typical after that, you would, as soon as sales and marketing and everybody was happy with the concept, then it was my job to take that wood model and turn it into metal. That same year, we decided also to make a mighty car carrier. That started as a wood model. And then when we got the approval for that, then I converted that into a metal working toy. Like I said, that was the standard way of developing a toy. You start with a wood model and then turn it into metal. Now, early on, I got the reputation, they called me the boilerplate kid, because I tended to use heavier metal than the other 3 guys. And the reason being is I would, like that front end loader, I had to redesign many of those parts quite a few times, because I took it home and dug in the garden with it, or the flower bed, and pushed on it, kind of tried to break it, you know, and like I said, something had bent, and I'd have to redesign and put thicker metal on it or something like that, which is kind of where that boilerplate idea came from.
Sure. That's a great nickname to have. Means you were making toys that lasted. I wonder if there were things that you liked most about your job and things that you liked least, not going back to the barbecue.
You know, the barbecue grill business, I mean, I didn't hate it as such, but it was a big disappointment that I was stuck with that as far as making toys, because I enjoyed designing and making the cabinets. The second year in the same year that I designed the loader, I designed a pedestal framework with 4 legs out, and on top you use a square tube for the pedestal so you could mount a round barbecue grill on it, or our version of a Weber kettle, which was a boxy shaped thing, and I got a patent for that. And so,
what did you like most about your job?
Well, I was a big kid, I guess, playing with toys.
That makes
I redesigned them when I was young,
sense.
and so, you know, I wanted to, whenever Charlie'd come down and say, okay, we need a mighty whatever, I wanted to do it. And he gave, okay. So like I said, he was happy with the loader, and he was happy with the barbecue. So looking over my shoulder, I was the designer of the mighty mixer, the designer of the twin boom wrecker. That didn't start as a wooden model. That I just went from scratch with that. And then the mighty dozer that's around the corner, we called it a T9 because it was actually a copy of a D9 Caterpillar. So I always tried to mimic as close as possible the real thing.
And the real thing that you were mimicking, was it a particular manufacturer, or it just depended on the vehicle that you were working on?
With the exception of that loader and the mighty dozer being a direct copy of the Caterpillar D9, no, it was just kind of generic, you know, trying to reference what's on the road.
What lessons do you think your work life taught you?
Patience.
Ah.
a lot of patience, because there are always people, and maybe I'm one of them, I'm not going to deny it, but who think they're smarter than you are or have better ideas than you do or whatever. And like I said, they called me the boilerplate kid, and you know, heavier metal aggravated the cost of the toy, you know, material-wise, and depending on how I configured some of the parts, it maybe aggravated the price of the die or whatever, or took more dies to, you know, it impacted the potential selling price of the toy. But the other thing I did was I spent a lot of time down in sub-assembly with the women that were putting together the unpainted parts. I spent a lot of time in final assembly with the women that were putting together and finishing the painted parts, putting toys on and everything. One of the things I would do is when we came out with a new toy, and typically we would run try to run 1,000, 1,500 toys to debug the tooling, and then also debug the fixtures or figure out what fixtures we needed to help assemble the things. So one of the things I always did, and the women in final assembly, the lead ladies and stuff, they really, they liked me, because what I would do, contrary to my cohorts, I'd go up there, and the tables had a conveyor belt that ran down the middle, and every, you know, so many inches there was a stripe. Okay, so a woman would do her thing, assemble her part, and then put it down there, and then it would move here, and that woman would grab it and do her thing. So we could vary the speed of that belt depending on how long it took to do the slowest operation, for instance. And then at the end of the belt, a gal would fold up the box or whatever and put the toy in it. So what I would typically do is I would start at that first position, and I would sit there and with the person that was going to have to do that, and I would sit there and put them together. And okay, you can feel comfortable now trying it yourself. Yeah, okay, so then I'd look over her shoulder, and then when she was satisfied, then I'd move to the next position.
Perfect.
And then ultimately I'd be down there putting it in the box.
Sure.
And I mean, and if there was a problem on the production line down the road, and even with toys that I didn't necessarily design, a lot of times I get calls from the lead lady or one of the
Sure, because they had worked
gals
with
on
you.
the line to come up there, and I would help them. You know, they could always count on me to help them.
Terrific. It's my understanding that at the height of Tonka that there were 3 shifts going on?
Yes.
So it was going 24 hours a day?
Yes.
And these ladies came from nearby farms and...
Well, when I would be, I grew up in St. Bonnie, went to the Catholic school. Well, it was a 2-story red brick building that was tore down. It's a parking lot now and replaced by the one that's 1-story school that's across from a ballpark. But when I was going home from school, the carloads of women would be going down 110 in St. Bonnie to go down to Mound for the second shift. And they'd come from Waconia or Cologne, Norwood, Young America, New Germany, Winstead, I mean, from all over. And typically in the early days, you know, like when I was just a kid, they were primarily from the western side, a Mound, and a heck of a lot of them were farm wives. They were augmenting the income for their husband's farm work.
It must have made quite a difference in downtown Mount. I know that that was before you were a kid at the time, but it must have made quite a difference to have all those folk coming into town.
Well, we had a few grocery stores, not just one, and people would do the grocery shopping here, you know, and there were some bars and some of the people, not the women, but some of the guys, you know, be at the Legion Club or whatever. So, I mean, or get their hair done or get a haircut or whatever. So, I mean, there was they impacted the business community in Mound.
For sure.
In a positive way.
Yeah. I understand there were even several car dealerships.
Yes. Yeah, one was directly across from the Catholic Church on 110, and the other one was torn down to expand the Tonka toy plant that's across the street over there.
So when they moved out of town, that again must have impacted the community dramatically.
Generally speaking, when we were up to speed in summer, you know, you'd have roughly 1,500 people.
Wow.
Yeah, all of a sudden they disappear.
For sure.
And then when they left Mound, we also had the facility down in Spring Park, which used to be the J.R. Clark building. So that was warehouse space, and a little part of it was set up to remanufacture or fix the screwed up toys that were coming from Juarez, Mexico, which were the tiny Tonka toys that started. You know, the tiny Tonka toys were labor intensive, and the mighty dump was material intensive. You know, so it almost took as much fiddling to do a little tiny Tonka dump as the mighty dump. So in 81, 82, I mean, they built this plant in Juarez and moved all the tiny Tonka toys down there. Well, there was always some rumbling about high taxes and the cost of labor here in Mound in Minnesota. And, you know, there was talk a few years earlier in the 70s, every once in a while you'd hear something about maybe going to Alabama or someplace down south where it's cheaper to make toys. And nothing really came of it. You know, just once in a while you'd hear something, but then all of a sudden they announced they're going to build a plant in Juarez, Mexico in 1981, and then when that was done, the tiny Tonkas went down there. So then the next thing, well, across the river is El Paso, Texas. Well, let's move the rest of the manufacturing down there. And if you look at that plant across the street, Tonka never thought that they would get as big as they did. The transformer that switch station that sits where it is now used to sit right where the western end of the Tonka plant was, and kind of straight across from the road that came up to the museum here was a car dealership. That got wiped out, you know. But generally there were homes, and that was this little incline going up the hill. Well, the last addition was the biggest addition, which was the press room. And there was a big concrete ramp to get from the elevation in the press room up to subassembly. And subassembly, prior to that last addition, was the press room and subassembly, and et cetera. So you had elevation changes, and you were pinched between that railroad track and the road. And so the way material flowed through the plant wasn't ideal. So the head of engineering, when they realized we were going to pull out of Mound, they laid out a plant that, you know, you put raw materials at one end and finished materials come out of the other, and, you know, a good idea, you know, from a manufacturing point of view. But Farrah Fawcett Jeans had a sewing plant in El Paso and a warehouse across the street from where the plant was. Went up for sale. Oh, management couldn't buy that place fast enough because we can get that cheap labor 6 months or so sooner. Well, to back up just a little bit, every spring for quite a few years before Tonka left Mound, the union organizers would be running back and forth and out in the street trying to talk to employees coming out after their day shift to unionize that plant. That went on for quite a few years. And like towards the end, instead of just people coming from the west side of Mound, people started coming out from Minneapolis, you know,
to work?
North and south, the suburbs and stuff. And they had a different outlook on life. And there was the last union election, the tool room went union, and the plant, the tool makers, that would maintain the dies and molds and stuff like that, and the plant almost went union. The family, at that point, that was the official end of the Tonka family, where management and all the workers seemed like, hey, we're in this all together. So that's when it really started picking up on, we got to get out of here and get cheaper labor and taxes.
Yeah, I remember in looking at the Tonka company newsletters, how much that felt like family. That feeling of family came through. There were articles about the members of the family and calling members of the workforce, everybody knew everybody's first name and all of that.
Well, so-and-so's daughter got married, or so-and-so's daughter or son graduated, or whatever.
Those newsletters are full of those stories.
Yeah, you know, newsletters about individuals, write-ups about individuals that worked within the system. I'm written up, you know, on one of them. But Doris Legault was the receptionist at the main door, and one day I didn't come to work. She called the house and wanted to know if I was okay.
Perfect.
Christmas parties, we'd have Christmas parties. The employees would bring their kids, and then they'd have tables set up with not mighty Tonkas on them, but you know, Tonka toys. You know, they could take whatever toy they wanted, you know. And we'd have a Christmas, you know, a luncheon and stuff like that. It was really like family, you know. Also, like in final assembly especially, there was some of that in subassembly. It was not uncommon to have 2 or 3 generations of women working in final assembly. You didn't have to really be pounding on the desk or the workbench or anything to get that 2nd or 3rd generation to work. Mother or grandmother didn't want you to create a bad name for the family, you know. So we had built-in supervisors and didn't have to pay for them. You know, my son's a hard worker, or my daughter, or whatever. I mean, it was family. It's just hard to explain that, but it was family.
Yeah, it certainly came through in the newsletters, even though I never got a chance to work there. When I first came to the community in 1981, I thought everyone in town had worked at Tonka at one point or another, because I would run into all kinds of people who you know, during their break from school or during summer vacation, and their parents as well.
One of the priests we had, Father Stan Mader, grew up on 110 on a farm between here and St. Bonnie. And he worked at Tonka Toys in the summer. It was common for a lot of these people to, when we were really pushing to get the toys out for Christmas, it was common for people going to college to work a summer job here.
You've mentioned a number of the toys that you designed that they produced. I wonder what you would say you were most proud of in that part of your work life?
A couple ways to look at it. I designed a road grader that never went into production that I was really proud of. And it never went into production because I didn't design it the way Charlie Groshin scribbled on a piece of paper and gave me verbal instructions to design it. But set that aside, it would have been a fantastic road grader, mighty road grader. The mighty front end loader, which I did, designed back in worked on in '66, and it came out in '67. I'm the most proud of that. And one of the reasons is because it was tough and enduring. But and the mighty line is really what helped Tonka Toys financially. The mighty dump was the most popular toy. I wish I had sales numbers for all the years, but I believe I think it was 1971, they sold 500,000 mighty dump trucks.
Oh my.
Oh, and the natural, the toy that would work well with that, they sold 375,000 mighty front end loaders. Wow. So those two toys were by far the most popular mighties, and brought in a lot of cash into the company.
Well, I wonder if there's something else that you thought we would talk about today about Tonka.
When the original three guys, started Mountain Metalcraft, they had intended to make metal hand garden tools and metal necktie rack, like is up in that cabinet. And the company that was down in Spring Park in that void space, it's now a void space in the J.R. Clark building, which originally was kind of a lumber yard kind of thing. And they made made some wooden toys. 1946, steel was hard to come by yet, and they made a steam shovel out of wood, using the wood that would typically have been used to design ammunition boxes. And then the metal boom and the shovel and bucket part of that, fellow that used to work for them at that period of time stopped in here a couple of years ago, and he said one of his jobs was to take metal meat cans and cut the tops off and the bottoms off, and then cut it down the middle and flatten it out so they could get those metal parts out of that. Well, in 1947 then, metal was easier to come by, and they redesigned it, and both the shovel part using good steel, and they came out with a clamshell shovel with a metal cab. And in '47, those three guys from Mountain Metalcraft and the principals from Streeter got together over a bar or someplace, I don't know, and decided Streeter decided to heck with toys. And Streeter, by the way, stayed in business, and Streeter store fixtures and stuff like that. That's in that family line. But Tonka, or Mountain Metalcraft, decided to make toys. And so Tonka Toys logo said Mountain Metalcraft, and above it's the waves on Lake Minnetonka, and then there are three gulls flying over the word Tonka Toys, which represent the three original guys that started Mountain Metalcraft. In 1969, the Food and Drug Administration, I'm pretty sure I'm correct on this story, but the Food and Drug Administration was given the task of coming up with toy safety regulations. You know, lead in paint, sharp edges. There were toys typically sold in the 5 and dimes that were made out of styrene, and if you stepped on them, all of a sudden it shattered, and I mean, you could pull the wheels off the axles. I mean, it was bad news. So the government, enough people push the government, hey, we got to do something about this. Well, companies like Fisher-Price and Play School, Hasbro and that, sat with John Preston, who was the fellow an engineer from England that was one of the people charged with coming up with toy safety regulations. So they came up with a draft of toy safety regulations. Now Tonka Toys, Nylent, Buddy L, Structo, I mean these steel, basically we were steel truck guys, sharp edges, and you know. The companies sat back and just let the preschool people with the plastic and stuff like Fisher-Price, you know, a good company, develop these regulations. So then they came out, so then they sent me down to Washington to sit in on this meeting because I was, you know, I was a gung-ho person preaching to build toys that don't fall apart and stuff like that. Ray Freegard, who we hired in later years from Detroit, worked for the automakers. He was a clay modeler. He'd model parts inside the car or whatever, taillights or whatever. That's what his function was. And he made a comment a few years ago which kind of made me happy and surprised me. He said when he came to work in his term working at Tonka Toys, I was the conscience of the department. I mean,
that's something to be quite proud of.
Yeah, but I tick people off once in a while, but that's not good enough, you know.
For sure.
But
good for you.
But they sent me down to Washington because I had that reputation. The older fella from Fisher-Price in charge of quality control, and basically these were quality control managers from the companies that worked on it.
Sure.
We talked back and forth, so okay. So especially a fella from Fisher-Price, you guys build good toys, you know, and safe toys. We're really after the five and dime guys that are peddling junk, you know, blah, blah, blah. So I came back home with a set of regulations. We had about 115 toys or something like that in the line. So in R&D and different manufacturing types, quality control people and stuff, we split up into teams. And because I was a designer, I could not go and test anything I ever developed because I'd be prejudiced. So I mean, God bless management, you know, they wanted this as fair as possible. So we went through and came back, the different groups, and I had a group, you know, and anyway, we came back, sat down at a long table, and the executives was there. Charlie Groshin was down at one end of this long table. I was at the other end, and John Hastings, I believe it was, who was our materials expert in R&D at that point. I think he went through most of the toys I had designed. Only a handful of toys passed those regulations.
Really?
Right. The ones that had the least rework required or redesign required were the toys I worked on.
Perfect.
And John Hastings is going over what's wrong with the Mighty Loader or what's wrong with the, you know, blah, blah, blah.
Sure, sure.
And Charlie leaned over like that and great big smile on his face, you know.
Perfect.
You know, so even though he and I butted heads once in a while, like my stubborn German attitude or whatever, and Charlie was a stubborn German, but I was 23 years old, and it was April of that first year in 1965, and Charlie came down, which he did to oversee what was going on, And he didn't like the design of a certain barbecue grill part that I had designed from a die standpoint, okay? So he's sitting there and scribbling on a piece of paper, alternate part design. I'm this 23-year-old snot-nosed kid that they're working in the 4th month versus Lee Filesticker, who had been there for years, and Zibakowski. So the layout of the department was 2 workbenches. I was facing Filesticker, he was facing me, and then a space about like this, and Johnny Danielson and Ted Zibakowski facing each other. And so Charlie is scribbling, and I shot down his design, and then another one. And this kept up for almost a half an hour.
I see.
And I kind of looked up at Filesticker, and Filesticker is just, and Charlie he still got his head down and he's scribbling. And then I turned around and I looked at Zibakowski, who was facing me, and Johnny Danielson, he's, and like Filesticker, I mean, these guys are, Filesticker for sure, are old enough to be my father. Okay. And so Johnny Danielson, God bless him, he's sitting there. His cheeks are red as a beet. He's got his hand over his mouth. Tears are rolling down his cheeks. He's doing everything he can to keep from letting Charlie know that he's laughing. You know, and after about a half an hour, Charlie got ticked off and walked out and slammed the door behind him because he couldn't come up with a better idea. That was kind of and he hired me in the first place, right?
Sure.
But that was the kind of the relationship we had. I mean, he respected what I did, but he also didn't like the idea when anyway. I talked about this road grader earlier. Charlie came down, he said, we need a mighty road grader. And he came right up to me because he knew I wanted to do the mighties and stuff, and I typically had done a decent job with that. So he says, take the mighty loader. He scribbles on a piece of paper. He said, take the mighty loader, take the loader arms off of it, and build a frame out in front of it. And, that'll be the new mighty grader. And I thought, okay, so then he left. And I thought, what a stupid idea and dumb-looking road grader. So what did I do? I reverted back to, I got a picture of a real Caterpillar road grader. What I did is I started laying out the real Caterpillar road grader, starting with the mighty motor and chassis part. That was it. And then building from there, and a cab and all that good stuff. Well, we made part drawings of every metal part. We got tooling quotes for every metal part, and it was all metal. There were no new molds required, just steel stamping dies. And we were ready to give the jobs out. And Charlie came down and he killed it. I almost quit my job over that. Mm-hmm. And Ted Zibakowski, who was the supervisor and stuff, I went to Ted, I said, I'm going to go up and talk to Charlie. I said, it's just not right that we're not going to make that road grader. He said, Ron, I wouldn't do that if I was you. He said, I've been bugging Charlie about it. Sales and marketing have been bugging Charlie about it. He said, if you go up there and bug him about it, he's liable to fire you on the spot. He's so hot under the collar. So I gave up. So the next year, he comes down, he walks past my workbench, and he goes to Lee Filesticker, the first guy he had hired, scribbles the same bloody thing out, an idea. And that's the road grader that Tonka built. but there is on the side there's like a wing, and on my road grader I had designed that wing because back in the day Hennepin County was running around here on 110 in different places with road graders that had a big V plow in the front some days, but they always had this wing on the side that would plop down so they could widen the road and stuff. But Charlie liked the wing idea, so he had Lee Filesticker put one on his road grader. So that was the only concession to my original road grader that he made.
Well, I really appreciate your spending time with us today. Thanks for telling us about your adventures at Tonka.
You're welcome.